Hello and welcome back to the final day of the New Cities Wellbeing Cities Forum. I'm your host, as always, Greg Lindsay, Director of Research. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel session here on the virtual main stage on co-constructing an equitable mobility future. And if you know New Cities, you know that this is a question that we are intimately familiar and involved with, which is, of course, the fact that mobility is essential to well-being, essential to actually thriving in the urban realm. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has struck an incredible blow at the transit systems of the world, which of course provide an equitable backbone to how we move through cities. As in everything else, the pandemic has sort of underscored the inequality that is already existing in our mobility system. And so we're very excited to have a conversation today about how do we build back better, so to speak, to coin a phrase, from the pandemic, and to basically center mobility at the heart of cities from a well-being perspective. If you know us, you know we talk endlessly about these from a number of different issues, but it's great to have this conversation from the perspective of well-being and equity for all. So on that note, I'll turn it over to our moderator for the session, who is Hana Creger. She's the Equity Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute. The floor is yours, Hana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Really looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to start off by giving each panelist 2 minutes or so just to introduce themselves. And let's start off with Angela.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Johnson Rodriguez. I'm the Statewide Organizing Director at Transportation for Massachusetts, as well as the Board President of the Boston Cyclists Union. And of course, I live here in Boston, Massachusetts, originally born and raised in Houston, Texas. I say a lot of what I do is about alignment between grasstops coalitions and organizations like myself, as well as grassroots organizations and environmental justice organizations in their communities. Often we are not aligned. Sometimes we are unfortunately in opposition, but without actually understanding why we are in opposition, or at least from the grasstop side. The great thing about my position is that I've been able to explore why and how, and really start to bridge a lot of those relationship gaps that have been created and making them a lot better for just the both of us.
Thanks, Angela. Wow, I feel like you're my East Coast counterpart. I do the same thing on the West Coast in California. And let's move to Alyssa next.
Great, thanks, Hana. My name is Alyssa Chennault. I'm the Communications Project Manager for Smart Columbus, which is a public-private partnership between the City of Columbus and Columbus, Ohio, and the Columbus Partnership, which was awarded the Smart City Challenge U.S. Department of Transportation grant back in 2016. And I'm in charge of the recruitment, outreach, and engagement around our 8 U.S. Department of Transportation funded projects. And one of the reasons that Columbus was noted as winning the Smart City Challenge was that we were using technology to improve mobility in our neighborhoods. So Columbus, is the 14th largest city in the United States, but we were working to improve mobility innovations in what we call our opportunity neighborhoods. So that's neighborhoods with low income, minority populations, underserved populations, and focusing not just on deploying technology for technology's sake, but really about creating opportunities and access through mobility and transportation.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. Yeah, I've heard a lot about the program and I'm excited to learn more. Next, let's introduce Trey, or have him introduce himself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Trey Ingram. I'm a program manager with the Toyota Mobility Foundation, and I am officed out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas in the United States. But TMF is a global nonprofit that's actually incorporated out of Japan. But we have a global reach with several people and offices spread out on many continents. But our mission is simply to enable more people to go more places. And we do that through sharing our knowledge, our Toyota know-how, our partnership network with others, and specifically here in the United States, working with nonprofits, transit authorities, cities, and other governmental groups through projects that specifically focus on mobility system integration and mobility for the underserved. Personally, my background is in urban planning and transportation planning. And prior to my life at Toyota, I worked at the North Central Texas Council of Governments working on sustainable transportation infrastructure projects. So I'm happy to be part of this panel and looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Trey. I believe we are still waiting for one panelist, Darnell, to join. I might as well just introduce myself a little bit. Hana Krieger, Program Manager with the Greenlining Institute. We are a research and public policy nonprofit, and we've been advocating for all things racial equity for 27 years. We work across almost every policy area, but I lead our transportation and mobility equity work, working across active transportation, public transit, new mobility, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and whatever comes next. So I guess I'll just kind of keep us moving along. If Darnell joins, happy to pause and make sure he gets his chance to introduce himself as well. So I think before just jumping straight into questions, I always think it's important to open up by doing some level setting on equity, because it's so important to recognize that equity goes so far beyond just access, right? I mean, equity is really about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm oppressed groups of people. Equity is also about increasing access to power. It's about redistributing resources, eliminating barriers to opportunity, and really empowering marginalized communities to thrive and reach their full potential. And so if we're not trying to change that inherently unjust system, and we're just merely trying to provide a little bit more access or a few more breadcrumbs for folks, then that's not equity. And in reality, that's equity washing. And that's what we really have to actively work to combat. Because as equity becomes mainstream, there's a huge risk that it can turn into an empty promise if there's not a clear strategy to achieve that promise. And that's important because equity is not a commitment, it's a practice. And from Greenlining's perspective, that means, within any mobility project, policy, or program, equity must be embedded within the mission, vision, and values, the process of how it's developed, the implementation, and the evaluation. And so that's kind of like how we look at comprehensive equity, and one way we can kind of hold ourselves accountable to meeting our equity goals. Oh, and I'm so glad while I was rambling that Darnell joined in, and now he can introduce himself. Can you introduce yourself for just 2 minutes or so?
Sure, I'm Darnell Grisby, happy to be with everyone. I'm Director of Policy Development and Research for the American Public Transportation Association. We represent the vast majority of transit agencies in the United States, as well as the infrastructure behind them, such as the consultants and engineering firms. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Darnell. Really respect all the work that you do. So now that I kind of just gave that intro overview, everyone's introduced themselves, I'd like to start with a pointed question to Angela. How has your coalition been able to operationalize transportation equity in your work?
So what I will say is that it was a long time coming. When Transportation for Massachusetts, which is a statewide advocacy coalition, when it was first, excuse any background noise here, when T4Mass has been around for almost 10 years now, and of course when it was first created, no one was really talking about social equity. No one was even talking about equality. We've come a long way as a society to where we are right now, which is even going further than equity. We're talking now about justice. So what we've definitely learned as we have also been on this long, sometimes frustrating, let's be perfectly honest, sometimes very frustrating journey of understanding what equity actually means, not just to the communities that we are hoping that we are trying to support and gaining better transportation access in their everyday lives, but also what does that mean to us individually? And how does that really play out as, of course, we are all coming at the concept of equity from very different levels. These are our own life experiences. And so what we've really learned in our work is that smaller organizations, grassroots, environmental justice focused organizations are woefully underfunded. And yet they're doing some of the true groundwork, a lot of the grunt work even, in regards to making sure that their fellow neighbors are able to access economic opportunities, are able to access food, are able to move around to green spaces so that they can finally breathe clean air, which many of our environmental justice populations up here in Massachusetts do not have access to. And so T4Mass is in the very fortunate and privileged position to have a great deal of funding. And we already provide funding to our members. So why not look at our books again and see if we could spread that pot a bit. And so that's exactly what we did. So in 2018, we started to lay down the groundwork of what it would be like to provide sub-grants, smaller grants, because, although we are a coalition, we're still a staff of 5, like most of the organizations around the table here. What does it look like to provide sub-grants to organizations all around Massachusetts? And what does it look like to provide sub-grants to organizations that may actually not be within our orbit, just due to capacity constraints, et cetera? So in our first year, we provided sub-grants to 12 different organizations, 10 in Massachusetts, 2 actually outside of Massachusetts, 1 in Maryland and 1 in Vermont, to support to the programs that they are already working on in regards to transportation and climate and public health at the access of social justice. And then this year, we actually funded an additional 12. So I'm trying my best to make sure this can be an ongoing program, because this is an ongoing issue. Access to transportation, especially in the era of COVID, it's regressed a bit. It absolutely has, which means that a lot of these organizations are even more capacity strapped, are even more looking for that, that sort of funding that they know is going to be there, because it's also an issue too. Many grassroots organizations, they may have access to dedicated funding. A lot of small organizations, sometimes that funding is there one year, sometimes that funding is not there the next year. And that puts them in a very tenuous position. And that in itself is an issue of justice. We're not a grant-making organization. However, we do believe that this grant-making process should be a part of T4Mass's strategy. And I would like to see it continue to go forward as long as we have the funds to do so.
Thanks so much, Angela. I love what you said about providing sub-grants as a form of capacity building. As a grass tops organization ourselves, that's also kind of a strategy we're now deploying. And another theme I'm hearing is it's so important to define what equity means to communities, to us individually, and to be very specific about which populations we're talking about. If equity is not defined clearly in your mission, you will have no way of evaluating if you're even meeting your goals, right? So next, I want to continue focusing in on public transit. We know low-income folks, people of color, people with disabilities rely heavily on public transit. And so I want to turn it over to Darnell, who is obviously very familiar on this topic. So my question to you is, what is the public transportation industry doing to address mobility justice, given the increased focus on social justice in the United States?
Absolutely, and it's a commitment, because really it's about interlocking systems of oppression, and it's historic in nature, and it's actually continuing as well. So it's all about how we built our cities historically, who has a seat at the table in terms of governance. That's one of the issues that we have to look at. So one thing that we've looked at doing and are doing, we also provide grants to grassroots organizations around the nation. In fact, we just met this morning to go through our applicants, and one of the key criteria that we included this year is a commitment to social equity, and we want to see a platform from the applicants that showed they are reaching out to communities of color and other disadvantaged communities that have been impacted by long-term systems of poor investment and interlocking systems of oppression. The other thing that we're doing, we're developing a framework. We call it the Apta Action Plan on Racial Equity. So we're looking at how do you define racial equity? So we're actually looking at, just like you said, Hana, we have to actually go through it and ask the question, what communities are we talking about? What is the definition? So we're defining it right now. One of the things that we're really concerned about, we actually are making sure is core to the definition, is this concept of intersectionality, because all of us have intersectionality. And the way that we interact with the world is not what it always appears to be. And that could actually contribute to interlocking systems of oppression if we're not paying attention to what those are. So for example, the life of an African-American woman might be vastly different than mine as a African-American gay male. And how does that interact with the built environment and with systems of oppression? The other thing we're looking at is this notion that there's no such thing as a neutral policy. There's anti-racist policy, and then there's racist policy. And if you're able to look at the world from that frame, you really can actually do some really good analysis about past practices, what's going on now, and ways to address them. One of the things we want to do is to create a voluntary member commitment. So, we have 1,500 members. So we're moving forward with a voluntary commitment and a recognition program on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And some key elements that we're looking at including is a set of core non-negotiable principles to adhere to as a signatory. Include a standardized set of metrics. Allow for continual improvement. Cover both what is internal to the organization, how the organization itself is functioning, but also what kind of work are you doing in the world externally? What is your revenue service, your projects, your ridership? What is the customer experience? One of the key elements in the United States has been for a long period of time is that transit is for those who cannot find other ways to move around the city or the community, which means it's not considered a first-class way of moving around. That needs to end. So confronting that is going to require a lot of things, including a recognition that we need to change that, but also support from our funding partners to ensure that we actually can do so. Really, I don't want to go into too long, but metrics are something that is very key and core to this. So we got to make sure that we know what kind of progress we're making. And we also want to mentor and engage with our membership to really help them through this process, because really what we're talking about is a series of very difficult conversations, or at least difficult for some people who may not have been exposed. We want to make sure that they have a way to share their experiences in an honest, straightforward fashion. And this is one way you can move institutions that may not reflect their ridership and their customers, but actually want to do better.
Thanks so much, Darnell. I love what you said about equity metrics. And I think it's also important to note that everyone's always asking for what are the equity metrics? There's no standard cookie cutter equity metrics, right? It completely varies depending on what community you're in, what geography you're in, just all these different factors. And so it's so important that we think about equity metrics in a very flexible way, and that communities have to be involved in shaping and selecting the appropriate equity metrics. It's this whole big topic, but it's so important. And I also loved what you said about intersectionality, and that kind of is a nice segue into my next question for Trey. I mean, it's so important to think about equity in an intersectional way. And I feel like one population that kind of gets left out of specifically the new mobility conversation are people with diverse abilities. And then particularly when you layer in, people of color with diverse abilities, women of color with diverse abilities. And so my next question for Trey is, what are some of the on-the-ground examples and strategies for deploying new mobility technologies and services to increase mobility and access for persons with diverse abilities in order to increase equity for an historically underserved population group for transportation services?
So thank you for the question, Hana. Just as an introduction to my response, Akio Toyoda, who's the president of the Toyota Motor Corporation, has said previously that one of his goals is to help transition Toyota from just an automobile company to a mobility company, and really think about how we can start to create new ways to help people not only move across, their city, their town, their neighborhood, but also just across their room, across their house, across their yard to get the mail. And one of the primary reasons that the Toyota Mobility Foundation was created in 2014 was to take our longstanding Toyota know-how and really share it with the world and with our project partners to find some of these solutions to community mobility challenges. And one of the kind of bedrock principles at Toyota is respect for people. And I think the conversation we're having today is about respecting everyone's right to mobility. And I think that that's really important when you're talking about people with diverse abilities. And I'm gonna thank you so much for using that phrase. I'm gonna give credit to Robbie Makinen, who's I believe he's the CEO of the Kansas City Transportation Authority, who is a blind individual, and he started using a different phrase, instead of saying persons with disabilities, people with diverse abilities. And just personally, I'm very interested in this topic. My 5-year-old is autistic and nonverbal, so when I think about what the future of the transportation system might look for him, it makes me kind of very invested in this particular work. So specifically about some on-the-ground strategies and pilots that I've kind of come across in our work, and I think that this has also become more apparent throughout COVID, is thinking about the integration of paratransit services with expanded public on-demand microtransit. I live in Arlington, Texas, and the city has partnered with a company called VIA to provide on-demand transportation, and they've integrated that with the HandyTrans service to open up access and create more opportunities for people who use mobility devices to not have to rely on an antiquated paratransit systems. Another example comes from actually the city of Tupelo, Mississippi, where the Toyota Social Innovation Group had worked with the community to do a community mobility assessment and kind of understand where people needed to go, specifically underserved populations. And out of that was a recommendation to help kickstart some sort of public transportation system, which started as just a couple of fixed routes, but based on customer feedback and some of the needs and just some of the realistic constraints, switched to a citywide on-demand service, which is providing access that just did not exist before for people with mobility devices. And one of the things that I like to keep in mind is thinking about how we are designing products and services for people who are either 8 years old or 80 years old, right? So that starts to break down some of those barriers of who is this actually for. And specifically for the Toyota Mobility Foundation, one of the ways that we have started to look at respecting everyone's right to mobility is the establishment of our Mobility Unlimited Challenge, which started in 2017 and was created to discover innovative ideas for improving mobility and independence for people with lower limb paralysis through the creation of smarter assistive technology to navigate their neighborhoods or their homes, specifically, neighborhoods where sidewalk infrastructure might not be as robust as some other areas of the city. And so as we talk today, a little bit about co-creating this equitable mobility society, very personal mobility from getting across your room, home, yard is an important element to that, which is why we felt compelled and called to create that Mobility Unlimited Challenge.
Thanks so much, Trey. It was really nice hearing about that. I'm excited to learn more. I just wanted to flag for the audience, go ahead and throw any questions you have in the chat. This panel is blazing through questions, so I'm like, we definitely got to make sure we have enough to ask them, but I'll do my best to have some prepared questions. But we're now going to move on to Alyssa. I think especially in this time, it's important to really center adaptive management into equity work, particularly when it comes to new mobility and technology, where things just don't always go according to plan, right? And it's so important to build in that flexibility. I think no time has shown that more than now. So this, again, is for Alyssa. During times of crisis, like COVID-19, the disparities that exist become amplified, yet resources to address the inequity may become more scarce. How has Smart Columbus altered any projects as a result of COVID-19?
I think luckily, because we're a public-private partnership with the city and the Columbus partnership, we're given some latitude that maybe cities have not typically taken advantage of or been prone to. And that is, fear around innovation or fear around iterating and failing quickly and then adapting and seeing if something will work better. So we've really been fortunate to be in that situation here in the city of Columbus, particularly around one project. We had an incident back in February where one of our autonomous shuttles that was operating in a neighborhood setting had stopped suddenly. One of the passengers slipped from her seat, and we cut service until we found out and got really to the bottom of it. worked with the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, got approval, put some additional safety mitigations into place to protect passengers in the future, and then COVID-19 happened. So this is a 10-passenger shuttle with seats on the right side, on the left side, and then the operator stands in the middle as they operate the shuttle. So with 6-foot distancing being, the norm going forward, and working in a community where we know is already at a higher risk of contracting COVID-19, we didn't feel like it was a good decision, even if we met all the technical requirements of going back on the road. So we worked with our community partners, St. Stephen's Community House in the area and low-income housing in the area that were 2 of the stops on our previous route with the shuttle, and said, a lot of shift in autonomy right now has been a shift from moving people to places and shifted to getting things to people. And food insecurity has been such a big issue since COVID-19 has struck. And luckily, St. Stephen's is also a food pantry, and they've really amped up their food pantry service. And so we worked with local leaders, the resident council at the low-income housing community, and said, would this be helpful to you? And St. Stephen's is located about 0.5 miles away from the bus stop, and the boxes are like 40 pounds. So there was a transit barrier there, that first mile, last mile connection that the shuttle originally was trying to solve anyway. So right now we've transitioned the shuttle to operating 5 days a week from noon to 3, we're trying to get up to about 40 boxes a day, and people have just been coming. I mean, the response has been incredible, sadly so that there is such a demand for it. But it's important, that we consulted local folks in the community who live along the route, who are living in the Rosewind community, to see if this is what they wanted. It also included working with our operators, hiring people from the community to serve as operators, because who knows the community better than the people who live in the community. And so offering the opportunity for paid positions where jobs might be scarce in that community right now, especially. And all of that, what that brings, such a much more robust program where they're a part of different local Facebook groups. They can post to their church's page every day when they go. And really it's created ties and overcome some of that distrust that we know is very real and very valid that exists in the community when it comes to technology and innovations and mobility in this space. So that's just one example of an adjustment we've made around COVID-19.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's great to hear that the city's been able to be very nimble and shift priorities like that. And I love what you said about hiring folks from the local community. Very important. So again, just another flag to audience to put any questions in the chat. I see we have one here. I'll ask one of my last kind of larger thematic questions for all of the panelists. So, I think it's becoming apparent nowadays that it's pretty easy to make a public commitment to equity, right? But the hard part is developing the plan of action, of getting input on that action, and then of sticking to that plan, right? And so what does it look like from your perspectives to hold ourselves accountable to advancing and to meeting our equity commitments? In the case of advocates, maybe what does it look like to hold the public sector and the private sector accountable to meeting those equity commitments? So whoever would like to start first.
So at T for Mass and at the Boston Cyclists Union, we're actually going through this right now. T for Mass started its first anti-racism training only last fall in 2018, and the Boston Cyclists Union is going through its third round of anti-racism training in the 5 years that I've been on the board. When it comes to equity as a building block of an organization, it is definitely imperative that we understand that this is a lifelong commitment. I think there's a lot of that sense that we want this to just be implemented immediately because, we need to be accountable to the public, and absolutely, you absolutely do. but it's also the understanding that sometimes it's going to be 2 steps forward, 3 steps back as the organization shifts. Organizations and coalitions are a little bit different because there are multiple players here at TPRMAS. We have 99 members and partners, multiple different levels of equity and where everyone is coming from. But there has to be just the fortitude to forge ahead and understand that you're not always going to get it right, and you're not always going to get it perfectly, and you're going to mess up. However, the way that you respond to any slights that may come along the way is how the public, how the private sector, and how everyday residents are going to perceive you going forward. It's very easy just to say that out loud, and yeah, of course, I'm going to mess up and I'm going to do better. It's not just, it's, yeah, you're going to do better, but then how are you going to do better? And then, who's on your team? Who are you able to go to and say, you know what? I really just don't think I'm getting this right. This is just very hard for me. I've never had to think about my race before. I don't know what I'm doing. I tend to tell my fellow colleagues that I would rather you tell me that you don't know what you're doing than to just continue moving along in life and just continuing to kind of falling back on the previous behaviors that you had before. Because the commitment to equity is not just a professional change, it's also a personal change. Because if you only change on one aspect, you're never going to follow through. So understand that your anti-racism stance going forward, it's got to be a 180 change, professionally, personally, and make sure you got people on your team.
Wow, Angela, that was super powerful. One thing I'd add to that is like your internal organizational work you have to do too, right?
Absolutely.
Like you can't hope to be an equity advocate on the outside until you clean up your own house first. Mm-hmm. Anyone else like to respond to that question?
Sure, this is Trey. As previously mentioned, respect for people and continuous improvement are kind of foundational principles that are really baked into our culture at the Toyota Mobility Foundation. And in terms of specific projects, we need to be able to create key performance indicators that are ultimately rooted in equity for the folks at the end of the day that we're doing the projects for, right? We're not doing projects just to do them. We're doing them to improve people's mobility. And specifically in a lot of the cities that we work in, one of the approaches that I like to take is that I really want to understand what their local goals are. We have high-level goals, but we need to be able to understand what local goals exist in terms of equity, and having that being the focus of the project. Because we're not looking to deploy mobility for mobility's sake, but really trying to understand that human-centered design piece and understand how that fits into our local partners' goals.
I just wanted to emphasize the continual improvement aspect that Angela mentioned. One sound example would be an organization could in fact be committing itself to anti-racism and be on the path towards plenty of anti-racist actions, and then maybe have a racist action the very next action they take. But they can get right back on the horse and then do anti-racist actions after that. So, one failure does not denote a problem that cannot be solved over the long term. And as long as both individuals and institutions keep that in mind, then they won't take it personally when they make a mistake. And that will allow for continual intellectual curiosity, which would allow us to break down existing systems of oppression.
And that's where I think documenting process and reviewing those processes at logical points, either throughout projects or at the end of projects when you're doing an evaluation period, and understanding where you can continuously improve as your organization and initiatives continue to evolve.
I think it's both internal and external. There's from a federally granted program, we have a performance measurement plan, that has opportunity as one of the goals, that we have key indicators and survey objectives that we're trying to get at. So that's like the internal process of how we're holding ourselves accountable. But there's also the external accountability, creating an environment where you're engaged with the community, that they know that there's space for criticism, for feedback. And for us, that means identifying leaders. We have on our staff 2 what we call Linden liaisons, and they live and work in the community every day, very much boots on the ground, and are really our eyes and ears in the community, who, you know, go to the mother down the street who is sick and needs some help with children, or to the church rally on Sunday. Different aspects that, you know, can be our eyes and the ears in the community, and who are trusted members of the community who can lift up those concerns to us. And it's really a two-way exchange of feedback and interaction, and reporting back to them, you know, we heard you, these are the changes we're making, and really being responsive. So I think it's both internal and external.
Thank you all so much. I really definitely felt lots of commonalities in how you all answered that. Equity is not just the commitment piece, it's the process, it's the outcomes, it's evaluating your progress. It's sometimes failing with grace and humility, and then getting back up and figuring out how you can do it even better. All right, now the questions from the audience are flooding in. So I will start from the top. This one's a little long, so I'm going to read it slowly. I live in downtown Fort Lauderdale, and I am blind. There are a lot of construction going on. Many of the sidewalks have been disrupted in the city, and the city requires MOT, a modification of traffic application, by each of these large construction sites during block size. Construction with the shut down streets without permission, not in accordance with their MOT. The city administration's development has not enforced any of these rules. It not only inhibits pedestrian mobility for the disabled, but for everyone. Most people don't recognize it because they have the second option of their automobile, which is well accommodated. How can the city recognize the importance of maintaining their MOTs, continuing pedestrian movement even during construction?
I can't speak on behalf of the city, but I guess my own personal view is that it's important to understand everyone's journey in your city, not just your traffic and your car movement, but all transportation users, whether you're walking, biking, taking public transit, and you know, taking your personally owned vehicle. And so it's important to keep that access open during temporary disruptions is probably how I would respond.
I'll jump in. I actually have a question about how Fort Lauderdale shifts when it comes to construction. Here in Boston, if we have construction on the sidewalk, which happens, you know, everywhere, you know, we in the city of Boston does not hesitate to take a travel lane. If there needs to be a diversion from the sidewalk, then automatically there will be a ramp of some sort, whether poured concrete or the use of plywood, I think that's the correct term for it. And then we take about, the entire width of a travel lane, so, you know, 9 feet or so, and that becomes its own sidewalk, so that people with diverse mobilities as well as able-bodied people are able to continue moving. My question is actually, is this on the books as a modification for planners in downtown Fort Lauderdale? It doesn't seem like it, but and if it's not, I would you know, ask that, you know, Fort Lauderdale planners and cities and the municipal agency start to look at that as a potential option. That there is space for everyone to be able to use the street, and there's also the understanding that the street is not just for cars, streets are for people. So if the sidewalk is not available, take it to the street.
Great answers, everyone. Moving on to the next question. I like and agree with the concept of intersectionality. One of the challenges is finding the right sequence of how to make this happen. Are there thoughts on a process for prioritizing those first steps?
I guess I'm struggling with the concept of sequencing. I start off with the premise that there's not, I'm not going to rank oppression, right? I'm not going to say that one group is more oppressed than the other. One thing that I have to get into is the concept of empathy, and to understand that my particular disadvantages may be experienced by others or could be even worse. And then, I just shy away from the concept of prioritizing or ranking, whether or not one group or another should get priority in the intersectionality conversation. I would just say that human beings are complex, and our interactions with the built environment and the world in general means that when you add additional layers of complexity, my experience could be more different than yours, and you could not understand, potentially you might not understand the additional challenges that I have as a result. So in terms of how to prioritize that, I think it goes back to empathy as a core root, I think.
I think how the City of Columbus with Smart Columbus has looked at it is we've taken a geography approach. So if we're looking at a neighborhood, really getting to understand who lives in that neighborhood and what their intersectionality is like. So in like the Linden area, it's a little more affordable housing. So you have, students from the Ohio State University campus. You've got a semi-large LGBTQ community. You've got Somali population. You've got older adults who have owned their houses for decades and been passed on, as wealth transitions from generation to generation. And so I agree with the point of Darnell, is it's not about prioritizing, who's worse off, quote unquote, and trying to tackle it that way. I think it's really understanding, if you want to focus in an area, really understanding what that population is, what the intersectionality looks within that population, and then addressing those needs.
Thanks, everyone. Next question. More often than not, equity means better performance for city agencies. Witnessing the link between the surge in private car ownership amongst lower income groups, with undocumented immigrants even risking arrest for having no license, and declining transit ridership in Los Angeles, Orange County, Inland Empire. What is really preventing more advocates and activists from making that argument clear? It appears to be a powerful one for building broad and diverse coalitions necessary for transformational change.
I would say there's probably a couple things at play. One is cultural. In our society, car ownership is still viewed as the kind of height of, I've made it. Particularly in a lot of communities that value that upward momentum and showing that you've made progress generationally. The other is practicality. As much as we would like for people to take transit, is not really practical for everyone in every situation. So it really goes back to investment and also the perception of transit.
And I also think that there could be other root causes potentially at play. Clearly, if private car ownership is rising, maybe they're needing to go a certain distance where either public transportation doesn't, happen to go to, disaggregated land use, complementary land uses, that has a lot to do, that could potentially have a lot to do with it as well. So really understanding what the root cause of the problem that you're trying to solve is, and then crafting mobility solutions that try to address that root cause, I think is really important, instead of trying to maybe continue to do what we've done for so long, thinking about other creative ways to get at what the actual root cause is.
Sorry, Hana, were you going to speak? Okay.
Please go ahead.
This may also just be an unfortunate issue of racism in action. Even if some of the lower income populations who are living in Los Angeles, especially if they are of color, may want to use public transit, is actually very close to where they live, it is sometimes safer for folks of color to be behind the wheel than to be on a bus, than to be standing next to a bus stop, than to be biking along on the sidewalk or on the street, or to even be walking. So the idea of just a private car in itself is sort of like armor against whatever perception that police officers or the general public, as we are definitely seeing in our society, may have against them. So it just could be easier to default to that, having that car option, even if that person may not actually have the funds to have their own car, or may not even have a license. It's very risky, but so is being someone of color in the United States.
And I just want to build on what Angela just said. I saw an article recently about the lack of parks in a lot of urban communities, and it made me realize that I too grew up in a community like that. And then when you start thinking about, well, there's not a tree canopy and there's not parks, and you're walking down a sidewalk that's unshaded in an era where we have hotter and hotter temperatures as a result of climate change. Increasingly in a lot of communities, it's impractical to actually be on the sidewalk, which impacts all of those things that we want people to access. And it actually drives people to car ownership if you don't have those complementary resources like parks and a tree canopy for the sidewalks.
Yeah, and I would just add that, kind of speaking to the building broad coalitions. So, I mean, the ultimate goal, right, is to reduce air pollution, to reduce the number of cars on the road, to particularly we just have to recognize that just given the built environment, given just like racism and transportation planning, city planning, that's just not always possible for folks. Ideally in urban areas, yes, people have the ability to walk, bike, take transit. To the extent that people need to drive, we should be encouraging them to get into electric vehicles, and do that by providing, huge subsidies, financial incentives, particularly for low-income folks. And so I think we have learned over time that like how to kind of broaden our advocacy to have a wide intersection of electric vehicles, electric public transit, walking, biking, and recognizing that, each person has completely different mobility needs, but we need to be able to provide access to whatever is best for them. So moving on to another question. Okay, a few of these are more comments, but I'll say them anyways. Calgary might be a useful case study for high growth, no transit, i.e. transit only if no car. Cities, auto-oriented, yet 20% modal share for transit. I have been briefing a colleague in Tampa who is a planner with Hillsborough County government about that, given how comparable the two localities are in terms of land area, population, built form, and growth. And a few other comments.
Can I comment on that real quick?
Sure, please.
I've been really interested in Canadian cities for this reason. When you compare them to their American equivalent, they oftentimes will have more transit usage. And part of that is because Canadian cities actually have more transit service. So it goes back to this notion that if we have the funding we need to provide additional service, we might be able to hit Canadian level ridership for those communities that are complementary, similar communities in the US.
Thank you. I'm just waiting on a couple more questions to come in. Apparently they're waiting in the Q&A tool. If anyone has any other comments. Okay, here's the question. How could we build an integration between all the sectors to build a new and smart city?
So I can try to address that one. At the Toyota Mobility Foundation over the last few years, we've been really building up our expertise and partnership network, what we call TMF 1.0, but now we're transitioning and thinking about how we can start to invest with our partner cities long-term and start to create areas where we can work with the city and the transit authority to test out new types of mobility services and products to help them answer questions as the mobility landscape continues to transition over the next several years. And there's benefit, not only for the Toyota Mobility Foundation and private companies that might want to come in and test something new, but then the city can also try to meet goals on how it might, how their local population might react and interact, and making sure that whatever the private sector and foundations like the Toyota Mobility Foundation are interested in are actually meeting mobility goals and understanding how people are interacting with what's coming into the marketplace.
There's a case study that Harvard University did around the Columbus Way, which is the foundation of our kind of public-private partnership with the City of Columbus and the Columbus Partnership of working with public sector, private sector, academia, nonprofits, advocates at all levels to really move towards, what is the future of a smart city? And I mean, in our case, it coalesced around the Smart Cities Challenge grant, but whenever there's money involved, there's motivation there, of course. But you're able to definitely do it outside of that. And we've seen through, some of the early tests and iterations and innovations we've done through the federal funded work through Smart Cities Challenge. We've seen more of an openness into the community of new ways of thinking about things. So some results of, we were trying to get public adoption of electric EVs, which at the price point they're at is, very upper middle class oriented, not attainable for certain folks. And so by seeing us able to achieve that goal of, a certain percentage, it gave people in our community different ideas about how we could make this work for other populations. So one thing we're looking at now is how we can do like an EV lending or car share service among a student population in one of our community colleges. So it's kind of, you have to start somewhere, and that initial step may not be serving the equity goals. Of course, there are implications of lower CO2 emissions that we know disproportionately affect communities of color, that they reap some benefits there. But starting somewhere and then expanding that so that it does help additional populations is some way that we're seeing, particularly in the Midwest and the United States, as some ways to achieve these equity goals long term.
Thanks, everyone. Here's another question from an audience member. How do we deal with the trade-offs that exist in trying to create a more equitable mobility system? For example, tolls that penalize drivers and lead to more sustainable mobility patterns can also harm people who are less likely to live near their work and have to drive, often lower income people. As professionals, how do we use an equity, or how do we weigh the positives and negatives of a project and use an equity lens while still trying to encourage more sustainable mobility long term?
I would say for that particular example that was given, I'm someone that has been supportive of the idea of tolling, even though I view myself as an equity advocate, because I think you can actually make tolling work in an equitable way. There's a ton of ways we can talk about that could actually make it cheaper or easier for those low-income communities that are further out to access opportunity, even when the roads are tolled. So I would say it's going to take intellectual curiosity and policy deftness to figure out how to do that. So in the case of tolling, for example, you can actually, I'm forgetting the term, but there's ways to actually provide money back to those low income communities, I guess credits. You can increase transit service in those communities by using the proceeds of the tolling. There's a variety of things you can do. So it's going to take innovation and thinking outside the box to really address those issues. However, I think we should continue to press forward on the idea of how do we reduce the use of highways and roads by pricing them.
Yeah, Darnell, I just want to second. We are very interested in the policy of congestion pricing, road pricing, with an equity lens. And so we're advising the city of San Francisco in developing a process where the community is deeply involved in providing input onto what kind of equitable congestion pricing strategies could they integrate. And so what they've come up with so far is a scaled system based on income. And so of course it's important like what the pricing structure looks like, but to Darnell's point, it's so important how those funds are spent, which neighborhoods are prioritized. And so yeah, it's really about how do we integrate community needs and decision making into the process of how we even figure out policies like congestion pricing.
And I would like to add, and if my director were here, he would jump for joy because this is his favorite topic. He loves to talk about congestion pricing. The way that we already have our roads is that it's the way that we design our roads, that we have designed our roads today, is automatically skewed towards a car. So in the way that congestion pricing and tolling works is that it is supposed to sort of equalize that issue. The way that we have public transportation, especially people who use buses, whether that be suburban commuters of any socioeconomic background, is that they are stuck in the same mixed traffic, the same congestion as anyone else. So they are on a bus, but they have none of the benefits of being in their own private cars. So even for people for whom car ownership is a bit more stressful due to the cost, they're going to default to a car because it just seems like the better option. And that's because we tend to pit cars against public transportation. By implementing tolls that are definitely skewed along income, that allows people to think of not just their car as the only method of getting around a city, especially if they are privileged enough to have multiple transportation options. It will hopefully shift people onto public transportation. And then it is also on agencies to provide dedicated bus lanes, whether that be bus on shoulder or their own separate sort of bus lanes like they have in Seattle, which are really cool, so that people can understand that, hey, this is actually a fast and efficient option for me as a commuter who lives outside of the city. Although it does seem kind of like frightening for many residents to think of, being told, or just because they're in a car, it's also just kind of freeing your mind and thinking of the different ways you can get around your city. And sometimes it may even be cheaper to jump on that bus than it would be to drive your own vehicle.
Thanks, everyone. I think we have time for just one more question. Do you have any experience with the challenge of expanding reliable public transit networks to distant and less populated districts of cities, especially suburbs? How do we go beyond the objection of unprofitability?
There are a variety of strategies, and I've seen a number of them utilized. One would be public-private partnerships with companies like Via, Uber, Lyft, to subsidize trips that connect in with core trunk lines of buses and trains for those areas that are lower density and harder to serve. The other is to have the debate about coverage versus ridership. And increasingly, communities around the country are redesigning their bus networks to facilitate higher ridership, because that's the expectation that a lot of them are being asked to do. However, that does lead to potential cuts to lines that are so-called less profitable, have lower ridership. So that really goes to the core of the question. Can we get beyond this notion of ridership as being the key metric of success for public transportation? If you can break that as the predominant way of judging whether or not transit is effective, then you can have a much easier route to expanding service to low density areas that are low income.
Just to add a little bit onto that, I live in Grove City, just a suburb of the city of Columbus, and our public transit has offered a microtransit option through Via called Coda Plus. And how they made it work from a fiscal standpoint was the city put in funds, Coda put in funds as a transit agency, and they also worked with major employers who had an interest in having employees be able to get to their jobs. So we have a couple of new hospital systems that have just come into the area and that are high employers now. And so, through a collaboration between the local government, public transit agency, and a couple private businesses, hospital organizations, they were able to fund and develop a microtransit pilot for a year and see if that helps. So I think finding, folks who are interested in seeing that be a success, there's some motivation there to get some microtransit options happening.
One thing I want to add quickly, I think when partnering with private companies, we have to think about the labor practices of these companies, right? And if we're talking about full scope intersectional equity, then we have to be holding these companies accountable to treating their workers with fairness and dignity. So I just wanted to make a flag for that. It looks like we are just at time, but this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed learning about all of your work. And thanks so much for being here.
And thank you, Hana, for moderating. I want to thank you for being an excellent moderator, and thank all of our panelists once more. Yes, virtual round of applause for everyone. Well, with that, thank you for this session. We're going to take a quick 30-minute break, and I'm going to invite all of you who are watching to join us for our closing keynote conversation on investing in people, investing in places. We're nearing the end of this year's Wellbeing Cities Forum, so I invite you to return after a quick break. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.